delighted that you could join us, those of you who are joining the class, for this special presentation. This is part of, for those of you who are our guests, it's part of a class that we teach here called Creating Resilience Amidst Resource Scarcity. And we have a special presentation today. And I'm delighted that the Reverend Dr. Jim Antal can be with us. He is Minister and President of the Massachusetts Conference of the United Church of Christ, which is the largest Protestant denomination in the Commonwealth. After graduating from Princeton University, his work at Yale focused on the yet-to-be-born field of environmental ethics. After founding a national organization to train activist high school students to oppose nuclear war, he served as executive director of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, USA, an interfaith pacifist organization. He taught for 13 years and then led churches in Newton, Massachusetts, and Shaker Heights, Ohio. An environmental activist since the first Earth Day in 1970, he authored and was a lead proponent of the UCC's vote in 2013 to divest from fossil fuel companies, and the UCC is the first denomination to do so. He's also engaged the spiritual discipline of civil disobedience, and that will be the topic for today. He's done this numerous times, most recently at the White House to stop the Keystone XL pipeline. And students in this class who have read Bill McKibben's Oil and Honey will note that Jim is mentioned on page 30 as being in the cell right down from Bill McKibben. So maybe you'll tell us a little bit about that.
I'd be glad.
So he speaks on climate issues all over the country. He's also an avid cyclist. You may see him on the road wearing his God is Still Speaking jersey. Jim and his wife Cindy have 2 grown sons, and we are delighted that you're here. So thank you.
Thanks. So it's such a great pleasure to have been invited and to join Liz in this great work that you're doing. I just love the focus of your class and hope that what I have to say contributes to it. I also want to give a shout out to your dean. I first met her shortly after she arrived here on Boston Common when a bunch of folks your age were preparing to spend the night, which is an act of civil disobedience, in order to get the attention of the State House concerning passing some laws at that time. It was 2007, I think, around making the state more sustainable. So she and I have struck up a friendship since then, and I have enormous respect for her. Let me give you an overview of what I'm going to run through, and I have intentionally scripted this. And as you can probably tell already, I don't much like scripts, but I scripted it because this is actually a topic that hasn't been discussed much in the past 20 years. If you go back to the 70s, there was a lot of discussion about civil disobedience because of the burning of draft cards and various things associated with the war. If you go into the early 80s, a lot of discussion about civil disobedience because of the anti-nuclear weapons movement and the Plowshare 8's actions. I'll get into that a little bit. There hasn't been much recently. So I'll stick to the script, but don't think that I'm scripted. Then we're going to fully engage in conversation, okay? So be ready with that. And if you're burning and you think this absolutely needs, just shout out, all right? Permission to shout out. Here's the overview. First, I want to set the stage, and I want to make some comments about where are we living, what time are we living in, and what is the track record of people of faith relative to having an impact on the situation we find ourselves in. Then I want to move to a brief examination of what is a spiritual practice anyway, right? And then civil disobedience. What is it? What it isn't, and how it relates to following Jesus. And then several questions. For example, when does civil disobedience become important? Why are clergy and religious leadership in these times important relative to the challenge of climate change and the opportunity that civil disobedience affords? What can civil disobedience accomplish? How might civil disobedience relate to our moral obligation to future generations? That's the key theme throughout everything I have to say, and frankly, I think it's the thing most missing from our ethics these days. is considerations about our obligations to future generations, right? It's a relatively new topic. For most of the first 200,000 years human beings have been around, we haven't been able to impact future generations. For the past 3 or 4 generations, we've had that capacity. So if that's a topic that engages you, we can go back and forth on that. And in the end, I'll end with some practical considerations, and I'm sure that some of you will be interested, maybe more in the practical considerations than in the intellectual dimensions of this. I'm glad to go in either direction. So let me begin by asking a question. What do Abraham, Sarah, Moses, Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, Luther, and Jonathan Edwards all have in common? Yeah, that's not an easy answer, right? The air that every one of them breathed. In fact, the air that every one of our forebears breathed before the year 1800. No matter where on God's good earth they lived, all contained about 275 parts per million of carbon. But over the past 200 years, as the burning of coal, oil, and natural gas has built the modern world, the parts per million of carbon in the Earth's atmosphere has gone from the steady state of about 275 to 401. And by the time our grandchildren reach old age, without fundamental changes in how we get our energy, it may reach as high as 850 parts per million. So the science is in. Reputable scientists all agreed with lead NASA climatologist James Hansen, who wrote in 2008, if humanity wishes to preserve a planet similar to the one on which civilization developed and to which life on Earth has adapted, CO2 will need to be reduced to at most 350 parts per million, which is where 350.org gets its name. So something we have yet to realize is that every person living on the planet, along with every creature, is our neighbor. Because the distinctions between this neighborhood and that one, between this country and that one, are insignificant compared to the fact that we all breathe the same air. Or to put it another way, and this is important, we all live in the same neighborhood, at the same address. Our common shared address at the moment is 401 parts per million. Imagine 401 emblazoned above every door. There's one more thing. This place in which we're all living, this place with the number 401 emblazoned on every dwelling, this place is no longer home. Home is a place where the number above the door is 350, or as it was for Mozart, Mary, Joseph, and the earliest human beings living in caves, 275. Finally, the extreme weather of the past few years is breaking through our denial. As of November 2013, a year and a half ago, 83% of Americans say the U.S. should make an effort to reduce global warming, even if it has economic costs. We're beginning to realize that if we were living in our home, California would still be producing 30% of our nation's food instead of turning into a dust bowl. If this were our home, America's insurance industry would not be dealing with dozens of distinct extreme weather events every year, each one costing over $1 billion. If this were our home, food prices would not be soaring, thus pushing the number of hungry people in the world over 1 billion. If this were our home, Glacier National Park, which had 150 glaciers when it was named, would not be counting the years, now less than 10, when all the glaciers will be gone. My presentation today, in part, is my attempt to answer the following question. Amidst these profound changes, or on this new earth, as Bill McKibben calls it, he spells it with 2 A's to make the point I've just made. What is required of us? Or, in UCC parlance, What does our still speaking God ask of us? So to begin to get at this question, let's briefly identify some examples of the impact people of faith have had on remaking their world in profound and fundamental ways. So first of all, some of you, I'm sure, know more about this than I do. In the first 2 centuries of Christianity, what really distinguished the church was their commitment to resource sharing, right? Second chapter of Acts actually meant something, and people actually lived that way. That's why they were a threat to the empire. That's why roughly half the Christians who lived during those first 2 centuries died as martyrs. Secondly, this is my favorite story. In the 6th century, I think it was 2 generations after St. Benedict began the monastic movement, the monks were praying in their monasteries in northern Italy and reading the Psalms, right? That's what monks do. And looking up at the hills, right? And the hills had no trees, right? Because of the sack of Rome. Okay, everybody with me on this? Literally, they had no trees. They'd been all burned out. And the monks just kept reading about the forest and the trees and the Psalms. And then, 1 hour a week, monks can actually talk with each other. They have a chapter meeting. And they decided we should do something about that. So they abandoned their monasteries, and for roughly 2 generations of monks, instead of following the order of St. Benedict, they became arborists. And they replanted the hills of northern Italy. Now, were they any less monks when they were arborists than when they were following the order of St. Benedict? The abolition movement, an obvious example of how people of faith changed the course of history. Bonhoeffer creating an alternative seminary when what he saw in 1934 Germany was the willingness of 95% of the bishops to salute Hitler. So what did Bonhoeffer do? He created Finkenwald and the Confessing Christ movement. The Civil Rights movement, yet another example, and finally, although you could probably find other examples of this, the anti-apartheid movement, particularly as it was manifest within the Church of South Africa. People of faith have quite a track record of impacting social change. So now let me say some things about spiritual practice. I thought if we're going to have this sort of catchy title of Civil Disobedience as a Spiritual Practice, we should start by saying, well, what is a spiritual practice, right? So I think people too often regard spiritual practice as limited to personal disciplines and attentiveness that make an individual more faithful. So in contrast, I want to embrace an understanding of spiritual practice articulated by Dorothy Bass and the numerous authors associated with her project around practicing our faith. Has anybody read any of the Practicing Our Faith books? Okay, so a few of you have. I think that's really the standard articulation of what is meant by spiritual practice. You can, if you want to follow up this talk, practicingourfaith.org is a rich site. I want to read her understanding of spiritual practice for you. Christian practices are things Christian people do together over time to address fundamental human needs in the light of and in response to God's grace to all creation through Jesus Christ. When we live the practices of Christian faith, we join together with one another, with Jesus, and with the communion of saints across time. I love that part. In a way of life that resists death in all its forms. A way of life that is spilling over with the life of God for creation, for our neighbors, and for ourselves. Practices point beyond the individualism dominant in our culture to disclose the social, the shared quality of our lives, and especially the social quality of Christian life, theology, and spirituality. Our thinking and living take place in relation to God and also to one another, to others around the world, and across countries to a vast communion of saints. Practices help us to understand our continuity with the Christian tradition, an important matter during this time of change and in the midst of a culture infatuated with what is new. So, my suspicion is if you were to ask, any of your classmates here in this grand building about spiritual practice, they would emphasize much more the notion of a personal kind of a discipline than a socially connected discipline, which is obviously her focus. They've got about 14 books, I think, that they've published that express different dimensions of spiritual practice, and the most recent one is one for younger people, sort of 30 years and younger. And I was interested in looking what are the chapter headings of that, right? Because I'm thinking wow, will civil disobedience be on that list, right? So, close but no cigar. Care for creation, one of the 12 that they list. Peacemaking and nonviolence, one of the 12 that they list. Doing justice, one of the 12 that they list. But even though there is this broader embrace of spiritual practice, civil disobedience does not make that short list. So what constitutes civil disobedience and nonviolent action? Let me first acknowledge that there are entire courses offered on this. Gene Sharp and many other distinguished professors made it their life's work to articulate this, but I'm going to try to make an attempt and boil it down into one long sentence that I will then parse out. When an individual or group deliberately violates a civil law in order to demonstrate their allegiance to a higher law, or to draw attention to a certain state of affairs or a system that they find unconscionable. And when they undertake this protest nonviolently and do not resist arrest and willingly suffer the consequences, they are committing civil disobedience. Okay, so let's parse that out. The ingredients first. Has to be deliberate. Can't be haphazard. Second, civil disobedience always has to do with following a higher law or a matter of conscience. It's not just about personal preference. Then there's the issue of allegiance. Integrity is, at least every action I've ever been involved with and all the reading that I've done on it, integrity is what is at the core here. Integrity compels people to take action. And it draws attention not to oneself, but to a state of affairs or a system. Civil disobedience is not about personal moral purity. That's something that the press always gets confused about, because issues of hypocrisy get brought up frequently in the context of civil disobedience. Rather, it's about changing the law or changing the system. And what is unconscionable? It's the law or the system that you're seeking to change. It's in violation of the kingdom of God, or what non-Christians who do civil disobedience would say, it's in violation of the common good. If an action is to be understood in the tradition of civil disobedience, the action must be nonviolent. Now, there's a huge discussion about what constitutes nonviolence, and I'm more than glad to get into that later on if that's a question that's on your heart. So thus, civil, the word civil is a double entendre, right? It disobeys a law, that's one understanding of civil, right? But it does it in a civilized way. That's what the nonviolence part is, right? It does it in a civilized way. Not resisting arrest and willingly suffering consequences does not necessarily mean cooperating with civil authorities. So, for example, often civil disobedience practitioners do not give their names. Instead, they refer to themselves as John or Jane Doe. And this, of course, infuriates legal people. And again, we could talk about that. That can sometimes be a funny conversation. It's not so funny when you're actually in the midst of it. So,
there's a story behind that.
There's a lot of stories behind all of this. There are indeed, and I'm glad to engage them with you. But so what does this have to do with being a disciple of Jesus, right? So I tried to see if there was any literature that was explicitly on spiritual practice and civil disobedience. And the only thing that I could find, and I couldn't get a copy of this, but I got a copy of the first chapter of it that's available in a PDF online. And the book's title is called The Sacrament of Civil Disobedience. I love it. I just love it, right? And it's by John Deere, who is a Catholic. No, yeah, his name is funny too. All right, I appreciate the humor about his name. He was actually my successor. I was the executive director of the Fellowship of Reconciliation in my mid-30s, in the mid-80s. And John Deere, I think it was in the early 90s, he served for 5 or 6 years as the executive director of, it's the oldest interfaith pacifist organization in the country. He was also somebody, just so you have an understanding of his stature, he was nominated in 2008 by Desmond Tutu to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. So he's a terrific guy, and he quotes Gandhi on Jesus. So Gandhi, you know, was an aficionado of Jesus. I hope you all know that. So I'm quoting Gandhi now in saying, Jesus was the most active resistor known perhaps to history. This was nonviolence par excellence. I love it that Gandhi said that about Jesus, right? We have to go to Gandhi to learn actually who Jesus was. So he points out that Jesus' resurrection itself, all right, confession, I had never thought of this. That Jesus' resurrection itself was both nonviolent and illegal. All right? Start processing that. It was totally outside the law and totally outside the principalities and powers that sought to contain that unbelievable power that was released with the resurrection. Jesus was deliberate about his life and his actions. His disciples try to talk him out of going to Jerusalem, for example, time and time again. He was fully conscious of the implications of his actions, utterly deliberate about the symbolism as he approached Jerusalem, entered Jerusalem, and engaged in what we look back as and call Holy Week. We can draw strength from the apostles and the early Christians, recognizing that after the day of Pentecost, Paul and Peter spent more time in jail than out of jail. When was the last time you heard that from a pulpit? And why not? Is our empire any less prolific now than it was then? What are the consequences of the Constantinian transformation of our faith? What if we were to blow past Constantine and go back and seriously examine the early church, its faithfulness, its understanding of spiritual practice, of sacrifice, etc.? So in the first 2 centuries, as I noted earlier, following the resurrection, more Christians died as martyrs than died natural deaths. So this to me is all deep theologic and biographic, if you will, background for our conversation today about civil disobedience as a spiritual practice. So let me mention now, in addition to this definition that I've tried to offer up on civil disobedience, let me offer what I think are 3 characteristics, which are a little different than the ingredients of nonviolent civil disobedience. First of all, vulnerability. I think this is essential. I don't know how many of you have heard Brene Brown's TED Talk on vulnerability. Like 8 trillion people have watched it. If you haven't watched it, it's really worth watching. And I would link what I'm about to say with her talk to some extent.
Can you say the name again?
So maybe somebody else can spell it better. It's Brene, I think Bene Brown. And if you just Google TED Talk Brene Brown vulnerability, you'll get it. You'll get it. So CD involves voluntarily becoming vulnerable. It's usually scary. When we get down to the practical aspects of it, we can talk more about that. I want to share with you one story. The first time I did civil disobedience in front of the White House, there was in the training that happened beforehand, there was a woman from Yale Divinity School and her husband were there, and he was pretty resolute and she was scared out of her mind. And she really helped. There was about 80 of us there being trained, and she really helped everybody by being very vocal. And as a consequence, being unbelievably vulnerable in her being vocal about what she was scared of. The lawyers were assuring us, oh, you won't go to jail. It's like maybe 1% chance you'll end up in jail. We spent 3 days and nights in jail. So it came as a complete shock, and her vulnerability the night before and her fears really, in a way, came to be realized, and it helped prepare us for what none of us knew necessarily. I mean, when you put yourselves in the hands of the law, civil officials, you are theirs. You don't get to determine what happens to your life. We'll talk more about that at the end here. So we're able to be vulnerable in undertaking civil disobedience because we trust that our life is in God's hands. Not in the hands of this guy with a badge or this woman with a cap who is overseeing us, and trusting that we're able to live in accordance with a higher truth. So that's one characteristic, vulnerability. A second characteristic is civil disobedience is an expression of spiritual freedom. Maybe this is like the most important thing I'm going to say today to you, is to link the idea of obedience to God's law as an expression of freedom. And obedience to God's law sometimes requires disobedience to civil law. It still gives you freedom. That's the key here. You're free from the constraints of fear. And when I talked with this woman that I just mentioned earlier, she spoke of how that transformation is what took place for her during that period of time of incarceration. The system of the world, the benefits, the security, the assurances that daily come our way, among other things, this whole system, it has two interests, right? First, it seeks to constrain us from expressing our outrage over injustice. The whole system is geared toward that. And second, it suppresses our hope, shrinking the horizon of what we can imagine to be possible. These two things have everything to do with climate change and the call of the church to address it, right? So the third characteristic, right? So vulnerability is the first one. Second one, spiritual freedom. Third characteristic is that civil disobedience draws strength from the spiritual freedom it offers so that the individual can cope with the sacrifice of personal freedom. Civil disobedience, among other things, looks to communal salvation rather than being fixated on personal salvation. So that's like a big meta thing. What happens when you commit civil disobedience is it's no longer about you. It's about this group that you're with. And that's a major kind of a shift that takes place in terms of your consciousness. As civil disobedience elevates the importance of the common good, it challenges and rejects the idolatry of personal freedom as the highest value. That's why people are terrified of doing civil disobedience, because they're clinging so tightly to personal freedom being the highest value, right? And finally, I love to put it this way, civil disobedience favors interdependence over independence. Now often, now I'm on to a new point. Often civil disobedience is symbolic, right? Sitting in the front of the bus, Rosa Parks, that was not symbolic, right? The law said you're not allowed to do that. So there was nothing symbolic about that. She was literally breaking the law. But trespassing at the Nevada nuclear test site, where they had set off scores of nuclear bombs in Yucca Flats, Nevada, which I did with Jim Wallace and 153 others. Trespassing, we just crossed the white line, just an arbitrary white line. Bunch of policemen standing on that side of the line, bunch of Christians kneeling on this side of the line, you cross the line, you get cuffed, right? That's symbolic, right? Now, the Plowshare 8, how many of you have heard of the Plowshare 8? Yeah, so just a couple of you. The Plowshare 8 came together, it's a group of people, including the Berrigan brothers and several others not so well known, who came together in 1979 and began to think what were they called to do in regard to nuclear weapons. And you need to remember, I used to teach on the history and ethics of nuclear weapons, so I could just go on and on here, but I'll keep it brief. You need to remember that at that time we had 35,000 nuclear weapons and Russia had 45,000 nuclear weapons, right? Now those stockpiles are about 20% of that, roughly speaking. So this was a big deal. It was an important thing to do. You could say that we're all alive today because, well, you could say this, or would I be crazy to say this? Because the Berrigan brothers and 6 others, including the guy who was the best man at my wedding, decided to walk into the engineering facility just outside of Philadelphia where they assembled the MX missile nose cones. They could walk in. The Berrigan brothers, who already had been arrested many, many times and who had a record known to official authorities, could open the door and walk in and stand right next to the nose cone of a missile, a nose cone which would carry 10 independently targetable nuclear weapons. They brought with them vials of their blood. They threw their blood so that the vials broke onto the nose cone. They brought with them hammers. They hit the nose cone with the hammer, dropped their hammers, fell to their knees, and began praying. So this is all obviously based on they shall beat their swords into plowshares, right? And they were arrested and they were jailed immediately, but then they went through a whole court thing. And I think Netflix has a movie that was made of their court case in which Martin Sheen plays the judge. Now there's a name you all know, right? Martin Sheen, good. And it's worth seeing it just for the high drama. But I bring all that up to say symbolic action. Did they in any way literally take out even a single nuclear weapon in that action? Not at all. Symbolic action. There were 44 such actions and hundreds of people of faith. They weren't all done by Christians. Most of them were, but not all of them. Hundreds of people of faith spent really hundreds of years in jail as a consequence of this. So the issue of being a symbolic action draws into question and often invites the criticism of whether civil disobedience could be effective if it's merely symbolic. And to me, at least, among other things, it brings to mind Jesus' parable of the mustard seed. Well, how effective could that little mustard seed be? Are you kidding me? And you might think that until you see a mustard tree. So how do civil disobedience actions differ from peaceful demonstrations? So I want to draw some comparisons and some contrasts. If I had, I probably should have made a slide of this, but I didn't make a slide of this. But I think you'll be able to follow me. So let me just go down the list. Peaceful demonstrations and civil disobedience both draw attention to injustice, right? Peaceful demonstrations and civil disobedience are both nonviolent. Peaceful demonstrations and civil disobedience both require personal commitment, but civil disobedience requires risk and personal sacrifice, which means taking on or suffering for some resolution of an injustice. Peaceful demonstration can be deliberate, but it's also may be spontaneous. Civil disobedience is almost always deliberate. Peaceful demonstrations and civil disobedience can both be rooted in conscience. Peaceful demonstration is willing to remain within the system. Civil disobedience deliberately moves outside the system in order to critique the system. After a peaceful demonstration, the person might feel a bit better for having borne witness. The person engaging in civil disobedience risks personal harm and suffering. Sometimes you feel better too, but you're risking personal harm and suffering. Peaceful demonstrations may involve interaction with the police. Civil disobedience almost always involves interaction with both police and the criminal justice system, which is a whole other kettle of fish. So how do we distinguish between taking a principled stand that puts us at risk and doing a publicity stunt, right? Civil disobedience involves risk of many kinds. One can never be certain of the outcome. Civil disobedience has never gotten much publicity, right? For example, Martin Luther King was jailed, anybody know how many times? 23 times, right? Few of those actions received much publicity even back then. While civil disobedience occasionally attracts some publicity, since the civil disobedience done during the civil rights movement, acts of CD have received less and less publicity. Burning draft cards in the late 1960s and early 1970s, that got quite a lot of publicity, but not as much as the civil rights movement before it. In the late 70s, the plowshare actions I were just talking about received very little publicity. In August 2011, 1,253 of us were arrested at the White House. 1,253 citizens of the United States were arrested at the White House, and it got very little publicity, right? So the media is very interested in hypocrisy, inconsistency, and conflicting moral principles. It has demonstrated very little interest in people who put themselves at risk for a higher purpose. So this idea that civil disobedience is just a publicity stunt, it's just a fake idea. It's a way of running from having to ask hard questions about civil disobedience. So when are such actions important? What's the basis for determining when such actions are necessary? And I'm guessing you're all familiar with the distinction between chronos and kairos. Nod of heads, yes? Yes? Everybody with me on that? So I won't go into that. So we're talking about when is there a kairos moment when civil disobedience is actually called for. So I will. I'll ask for a show of hands. How many of you know that knew that Rosa Parks was not the first one arrested for? Okay, excellent. So NPR actually did a big story on this, like 2 weeks ago. It was such a great story. One of the 3 people were arrested before Rosa Parks. 3 people were arrested before Rosa Parks. One of them was named Claudette Colvin. What, yes?
Colvin.
Colvin, is that it? I wrote, thank you for the correction. And she was interviewed on NPR a couple of weeks ago, and I had known this, but I had not known the detail that the movement that was, in the process of evolving and kind of waiting for the kairos moment, and also waiting for the right person. So this would be a long conversation about, well, what constitutes the right person? And that's a worthy conversation. And it really is all about, kind of when is the right time to do this. The movement felt that when Claudia, she was 15 or 16 years old, when she was fed up and decided that she wasn't the right person. Rosa Parks, she was qualified in absolutely every possible way. But guess what? This is something I didn't know. At Rosa Parks' trial, guess who was the star witness?
Claudette.
It was Claudette. And I didn't know that. It was great to hear that.
She was the first person, the lawsuit was filed before Rosa Parks because of Claudette, but she didn't get chosen because she got pregnant. And other reasons.
Right. So, but it perfectly illustrates this question of kairos. I'm not a Bonhoeffer scholar, but I can't imagine that when Bonhoeffer did decide to give out a call to convene classes on the beach in Finkenwald, I can't imagine that there wasn't a period of 1 or 2 years before that he wrestled with the idea, and finally it became the right time, right? So in mid-April, in a couple of weeks, there are going to be a week of turning up the heat at Harvard. Show of hands, have you guys heard about this? Yeah? This is around divestment from fossil fuel companies and Harvard University. Last October, Drew Faust, the president of Harvard, responded to a poll that had been done among students concerning whether or not Harvard should divest its $34 billion endowment from fossil fuel companies. And 78% of the students said it should. And Drew Faust wrote an unbelievable letter saying why that would be immoral.